What's a family secret you found out as an adult that completely shocked you? My uncle had essentially a secret family in the 60s. He was about to deploy to Vietnam. My grandma was pretty racist. He met a nice Mexican lady on base, they got married, he knocked her up. He went to Vietnam, she divorced him while he was gone because she couldn't handle the separation. He signed up for another tour of duty after that because he was heartbroken. When he came back she had remarried and been raising their kid with this new guy. Kid had never known him, everyone seemed happy so he walked away. Told no one. Then in 2017 or so when he was in his 70s and was on his third, okay actually fourth if you count that secret one, marriage and his last adult child had moved out of the house, this middle-aged Mexican lady shows up to his front door and is like, "Hey, I think you're my dad." This happened during a family barbecue. My uncle looked at her for a minute and asked, "Maria?" She said, "That's me." He said, "Come on out back, dogs are already on the grill." So that's how I met my much older cousin I didn't know existed. Her mom and dad who raised her had both died a couple years previously. Her mom, on her deathbed, literally said, "So your dad wasn't actually the dude who made you." It took her a couple years to decide to seek him out. Her only question was, "Why didn't you ever come around?" He just shrugged and said, "Your mom told me not to, and you had a good family, why would I ruin that?" She now lives next door to him. My great-grandmother had a torrid affair with her own nephew, got pregnant, had a miscarriage, and they buried it in a shoebox in the park. She confessed this to my mom on her deathbed, and Mom told me when I was an adult. My dad died in a car accident. I found out as an adult he was in the car with a cocktail waitress drunk. Not sure if she was a regular thing or it was just that night. She survived. I found out 2 years ago at the age of 34 that my dad had a secret family, and I have an older half-sister. Then I found out that he tried to name me her exact first and middle name before I was born. He pushed very hard to name me her name and that was their plan at first, but thankfully my mom changed her mind at the last minute for an unknown reason. I always knew that my mom's brother drowned while scuba diving in Mexico when he was 21. My parents had always told us he was there with a friend, but they never told us that that friend was my dad and that he tried to pull him out of the current but couldn't. As he was getting pulled under, he begged my dad to take care of my mom. My dad had to drive home alone from Mexico to Canada and then tell his future in-laws what happened. This was never a secret, but I learned at my grandpa's funeral that he won a Pulitzer Prize. It was from 31 years before I was born, so I guess by the time I came along, it was old news and everyone was sick of hearing about it, and he was always very humble about his career. My grandma immigrated to the US from the Philippines and brought my mom, 3, and uncle, 2, with her. Found out there was a third child, who was probably 5, who she left behind. To this day no one knows why, and my grandma was bat crap crazy so she took the reason to her grave. He found us all on FB about 15 years ago and it's got to be crazy for him. To grow up in abject poverty knowing your mom abandoned you and then discovering the rest of your family all living the dream in America. My great-grandpa went AWOL from the British Royal Navy and stole a Canadian's identity to come to the US. I just learned a few weeks ago that my grandmother, who is white, was engaged to a Japanese man in CA back in the early 40s. When America entered into World War II he was rounded up and deported. She tried to follow him but her parents barred her from doing so. How she ended up marrying my racist grandfather and moving to the mountains of WV is something no one seems to know. But it was why she was insistent on teaching my mom and siblings that racism was wrong and supporting the civil rights movement by sending her side hustle money to organizations that supported desegregation and diversity. It wasn't a secret as much as I think my mom just thought she had told us. The motorcycle I bought with my own money at age 17 didn't stop working on its own. My dad secretly pulled some wires out so it wouldn't work anymore. I found out many years later when my brother told me. Not an adult, but I found out I was adopted at 13 completely accidentally by finding a document with my last name listed different. That was fun. That my granddad suffered severe PTSD from serving in WW2 and the lovely old man I knew was actually a vile nightmare to live with for my mom and her siblings. I only learned years after his death that he basically lived on uppers and downers. Valium to sleep at night, amphetamines during the day. That a trust fund my grandparents set up for the family would have fully paid all expenses for college or trade school for all of us grandkids. Our parents never told us because it would have left them with less money, and this is after it paid for a house for them outright. We only found out about it a decade after they emptied it out. And now they wonder why none of us have the resources to help them in their old age, and barely talk to them. I dunno, maybe if you hadn't hamstrung our educational opportunities and pushed us out on our own, you'd have established and grateful doctors, lawyers and engineers to foot the bill instead of a bunch of late bloomers who had to build their security from scratch. Uncle Carl. Really a great uncle who was often talked about as an outlaw in a negative light. I don't even remember what was said. I was so young, I just know he wasn't liked. EWS&T my uncle, he was Uncle Charlie's boyfriend. Now poor guy, I guess he was bad-mouthed for being gay in a devout Catholic family? This was the 70s. My mom tried to break things off with my dad a week before they got married, but my grandpa, mom's dad, pressured her into going through with the marriage because they had already paid for all of it. This explains so much, but I didn't learn this until I was about 22. My real dad has in fact tried to be in our lives several times, even bought me my first Xbox and PlayStation. Mom said otherwise for 19 years of my life. This happened to me too. My mom told us my dad abandoned us and refused to pay child support when, in reality, he tried really hard to be in our lives and paid 2x what he was supposed to every month. Somehow, my mom would drain the card and then check the balance in front of us, and it was always, "Your balance is $0. She spent all the money on booze and drugs. I was made aware of this 2 years ago. I'm 31. My dad has not been in my life because of her since I was 8. That my whole family knew about my autistic tendencies, but raised me instead just to think I was lazy, nefarious, immoral, and choosing to ruin my own life and everyone else's simply because I was too smart to be autistic. I suffered for my whole life until I had a child of my own and finally got diagnosed. I cannot look at my child and understand how the adults in my life treated me the way that they did and still do. I had a similar experience. But in my case I wasn't hyper, actually I was like a robot. My mom liked to flex how well behaved I was because I could sit for hours just drawing or staring at the wall. Other kids would tell their parents how weird I was and my mom would get offended saying I was more smart than their kids and it was jealousy. She can't accept until now there's something not normal about me. My grandparents got swindled out of some very valuable land in West Virginia that was rich in earth minerals. A religious group convinced them to donate it in order to get into heaven. This sounds like the opposite of There Will Be Blood. I was in college when I found out I was basically the reason my mom dropped out of college and my parents got married. They're still together 58 years later. Thing is, it wasn't a secret. I was just too dense to figure it out. I was bored in church and was looking at dates in the family Bible and saw their wedding date and tried to argue with them that the year was wrong. It had to be the previous year because my birthday was only 6 months after their anniversary. They didn't say a word. Just laughed and rolled their eyes. My first husband became a father by another woman, while he was engaged to me. I found out when his kid contacted me through Ancestry.com. There are other surprises discovered through Ancestry.com. My ex-father-in-law had 5 wives, not 3, and he had 8 children, not 7. My current father-in-law, now deceased, was on the FBI's most wanted list in 1935. He was captured and spent time in prison. A ex-brother-in-law had a daughter, who he put up for adoption. I found out when she contacted me. I don't know about shocked, but my dad never told us that my grandfather emigrated from Italy to the US because he was running from the law. He shot somebody. My aunt, my dad's sister, told us after my dad passed. Not necessarily all that shocking because every story about my grandfather was some variation on what a prick or what a bastard he was. He died before I was born, so at least I was spared getting to know the old bastard. None of my cousins who actually met the old goat liked him. My grandmother was not a widow as I had always been told. In fact, my father was the illegitimate son of a local musician and my grandmother. It may not seem like a big deal today, but it must have been hard for my father, who was born in the 60s. My grandmother cheated on my grandfather while he was deployed in the military, and they gave the baby to my grandfather's brother and his wife to adopt because they had fertility issues. This was a family secret for years that my grandmother decided to disclose to her son/nephew at his sister's wedding. My uncle described the super close relationship he had with his cousin and said it made more sense once he learned they were brothers. She never disclosed his birth father, even when he was dealing with health issues and wanted an accurate health history. He eventually died of cancer. My uncle shared this with me the weekend of my grandfather's funeral. Grandma passed several years earlier, and apparently all my aunts are in denial about it. So, my devout Catholic grandmother had a secret love child. Back in the 80s I had a great aunt who everyone thought divorced her husband back in her 30s. They only found out that she hadn't because she was getting up there in age 96 and went to finalize her last will only to find out he was still alive, and if he outlived her he was eligible for part of her assets. She started proceedings immediately because, I'll be dongate if he gets anything of mine. I love the women I come from. I just found out a little over a year ago, I'm in my 50s, that my mother briefly lost custody of me when I was a baby because she couldn't stop going out to bars and getting wasted. My mom wasn't actually sick or disabled, just flat out didn't want to work but wanted the attention of being disabled. Textbook Munchausen. I had a grandma mom's side that was alive. Didn't know it until we went to her funeral in my mid-30s. Funniest funeral I've ever been to. Family is hella white. Mom's family comes from Idaho. Dad's family from Missouri. We're backwoods as all get out. So what's the proper funeral music to play? Native American war chants. Dad and all us kids chuckling. Mom slapping all of us. Fun times. Would like to add, after a subscription to 23andMe and Ancestry, there is not a single Native American in our history. Been with my now wife for 20 years. Early in our relationship I learned that some kind of big family secret existed on her mom's side, but the specifics of it weren't shared with me. One day, maybe a decade later, I forget how it came up, but I finally became privy to it. Turns out one of my wife's cousins, who is now a 50-year-old woman, her actual father is not who she thinks it is. And not in a was adopted kind of way. My wife's aunt, the cousin in question's mother, who still regularly attends family gatherings with this cousin, I guess just got pregnant from an affair back in the day, and everybody decided it was best to let this person think their biological father is someone who it is not. Even wilder, the actual father to this day still lives a couple of streets down. Very conservative grandmother had a very short, annulled marriage that ended abruptly when he handed her a hairbrush and asked to be spanked on her wedding night. This was over 100 years ago. My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. Back then pinball was pretty serious, I guess. It wasn't until recently my grandmother confessed on her deathbed that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body days before his own demise. So he was actually killed in retaliation for a murder that he committed. My grandmother kept this secret for almost 65 years. A cousin I grew up with has been a prostitute since she was in her early 20s. She's 56 now. Several older family members knew and kept it secret until about 5 years ago. Shocked, I tell you. More so because this poor lady fell off the ugly tree, hitting every branch on the way down. She's done very well, they husband and kids, live a pretty lavish lifestyle. Edit, she's been married over 15 years and has 2 kids. Yes, her husband knows all about it, he used to be one of her Johns. Mum gave my inheritance from her mum, my nan, to her friend to pay off her debt. Meant I couldn't go to the university I wanted to. Dad told me this just before he died as he wanted me to know. A secret that shocked everyone else. Actually, after years of being the model South Asian family, it was revealed that my parents' child-rearing superpower was that everyone was neurodivergent. Therefore, from the get-go, I was raised unconventionally because my parents refused to follow the harmful generational mold. This reveal came when I, eldest child, went to university, and had to pass a psych eval for working at a lab with children, studying psych/neuroscience right now. Then I got an email from the psychiatrist's office the next day, "Hey, do you want to follow up on this?" And so I did. And then I forwarded all the info package to my parents, to which Mom called a family meeting and we all sat down like so. Now we know what's up with all of us, to different extents. I have a few conditions, Sis has one, Grandma got the most. Truly a melting pot of undiagnosed conditions, LMAO. Except drama enters the scene when you take into account South Asian attitudes towards mental health, especially neurocognitive conditions, which are seen as the defective/unintelligent kind of disability. Secondly, my parents are trolls who never pass up a good chance to mess with someone. This has accumulated in whenever relatives call to compare children, which, why even? I don't understand why this is a thing. My parents respond along the lines of, "Oh, that must have been the autism," because they're tired of justifying why hitting kids is bad. Now we have conservative, like highly conservative. There's a reason we live in Canada when they immigrated to the UK. The ocean of distance is necessary. extended family pushing kids to pursue an autism diagnosis because they think it's some kind of secret academic superpower. The same people who thought it brought shame to the family is now chasing it because they decided my parents were the ideal model family, doctor plus engineer and successful kids is all they see lol. I don't know how to adequately translate how much drama it caused to someone who didn't grow up and hear years and years of ableist BS, but trust me, it was hilarious. My uncle killed a man with a pair of scissors after the dude laughed at him for being on hard times, was at a pawn shop. He's not blood related, but I felt bad my cousin had to deal with his father being a murderer. Sadly, my cousin OD'd a couple years ago. Pretty tragic branch of the family tree. Another branch. My great-uncle was killed in the war, his son drowned in a pool, his wife drowned in a hot tub, and the kid my great-aunt had after her husband passed died in a carbon monoxide accident. Tragedy follows some people around, it seems like. My great-aunt, born in the 1930s, was a perfect housewife and psalm, never drank or smoked, decorated beautiful wedding cakes and sewed wedding dresses, etc. After her death it finally came out that she had smoked literally all of her adult life, and managed to hide it from her children, nieces, nephews, friends, etc., everyone except her husband who controlled the money of course. If she had smoked all her life none of us would have been shocked, but she was always surrounded by kids, grandkids, etc., so she must have really been an expert at sneaking off. It wasn't really a secret I guess, but it never really came up in conversation growing up. My paternal grandfather kidnapped my grandmother and had her locked up in his bedroom for months. Basically forced her to be his wife. They both died way before I was born and I'm told she grew to love my grandpa, but I'm pretty sure that was just to cope with what was done to her. My siblings did meet her and say she was so nurturing and loving towards all her grandkids. She had 12 children. I weep for what my female ancestors had to endure. My brother is actually my half-brother. In fairness to my family, they never hid it from me, just didn't like talking about it, and as a kid I was oblivious. It wasn't till my aunt saw the look on my face at Christmas did they realize, "Hoopsie, we forgot to talk to you about that." My grandpa has a sister, not just a brother. Turns out Aunt Julie was kicked out of the family for spending too much time with her female roommate, wink wink. It was in like the 2010s when I found out, and the older family members refused to say she was gay. It was wild. I still haven't met her and don't know how to contact her if she's even still around. My mother is gay. Her sister disowned her after she found out, and told my mum she could never see my cousins again, because since my mum is a lesbian, she would molest them. She now pretends she's an only child, but they also have a brother. She disowned him also after she was unable to get money out of him after trying to extort him with lies about him sexually abusing her. She's a treat. Frick you, Aunt Gilly. All through my childhood, my grandfather was always critical of us. Our hair was too long, we weren't respectful, we were delinquents. We were just normal kids in the 1970s, but he was always criticizing us. He was held up as some kind of paragon of virtue because he didn't drink alcohol. Fast forward a few decades and the internet has access to public records and I can count. Come to find that he knocked up my grandmother and they had to get married in the 1920s. Hypocritical old frick. My grandpa mom's dad robbed banks in the early 20s in South Dakota and Nebraska. Both states wanted to charge him, but South Dakota won that fight. Sentenced to 10 years or so. A few weeks before his release he smashed a chair over the prison warden's head, stole his keys and his car and drove to his parents' house in Illinois. I think it was Illinois. The cops picked him up the next morning. Served the rest of his sentence plus some. He had a missing leg that I always thought he lost in a war or something. I asked my dad what happened with his leg. My dad said he got so tired of messing up that he jumped off a bridge and messed that up too. Found out the story through Ancestry.com and newspaper archives. All my youth, carrot/turnip mashed potatoes were called surprise potatoes. At some point all the kids in my family figured that we were the only ones where it was called that. Parents told us they would explain when we were adults. Well, when we became adults we got told. My big sister, when she was young, hated the carrot/turnip mashed potatoes. My parents at some point decided to serve the exact same carrot/turnip potatoes but call them surprise potatoes. Suddenly, best thing in the world. So yeah, they kept it a secret. They just pulled a fast one on my sister before revealing the whole affair when we could use the same fast one on our kids. My kids refused to touch rice when they were young. Any rice, all rice, they'd gag and walk away. But my dad's oven rice, that was whatever he found in the crisper along with some soya sauce? You'd swear it was nectar of the gods and they'd lap it up every time he made it. So I had to call all rice Grampy's rice until it was just rice when they got older. But when I do make oven rice, the kids will still call that his rice. Grandpa passed away a few weeks ago. The family tradition of memorizing a Cherokee princess name who was supposedly our great-grandmother was a giant lie to hide the fact that our ancestor had a black child.